In an industrial age, the focus from an economic perspective is to ensure that we have groups of people coming through processes to meet economic need. And so modern education needs to address modern societal need.
Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm joined by Clay Johnson. Clay is a senior learning technologist at the University of the West of England, otherwise known as UWE. Clay has a fascinating background, starting off his career trajectory in positions that included a rescue driver, an electronics technician, through to being a fireman. He now finds himself in senior education and is passionate about how education can meaningfully address issues of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. We're going to be talking about everything from multiculturalism to Clay's journey to where he is today, through to whether or not government has a positive impact on the trajectory that modern day higher education takes. Welcome to the show, Clay.
Thank you so much, Leila. It's a privilege for me to be here, and more especially a privilege to be counted amongst the esteemed list of guests that you've had on your wonderful podcast.
Bless you. Well, Clay, it is my pleasure to have you here. And I know the first time we're very kindly introduced by our mutual friend, James, that he spoke so highly of you. And I came off our call being inspired, and I felt like I'd had an education lesson myself, frankly. So, Clay, tell our listeners, how did you come to be where you are today, personally and professionally? So I know the story is, I mean, it's remarkable, really.
So, Leila, I was born during the 70s in Durban, South Africa, sunny South Africa, which is on the east coast of the country. And I grew up on a housing estate, I suppose that's the best way to describe it, that was established specifically for mixed-race people, or colored, as the previous government decided to classify us as. And this was during the height of apartheid. 70s and 80s was a period of great unrest in the country. And so what was established very early on in, the deployment of apartheid was this idea that the government would segregate people. And so established in 1950 was this Group Areas Act. And the idea behind Group Areas was that the government was going to move people out of their homes, physically drag them. And it was a case of literally giving people a couple of days after the areas were rezoned to pack up their belongings and move to the new areas that were created. And how the zoning worked was that you had around city centers, white people living exclusively. And then immediately outside of that, you had these concentric circles that were made up of people of mixed heritage, like myself. And then you had outside of that people of Indian descent. And in the furthest circle outside of these city centers, you had people, native people, incidentally, who were Black, having to commute between these zones to get into the white areas, because predominantly that was where all of the work was done. And so the place I grew up in, interestingly enough, was named after a city here, or a town here in the UK, Wentworth, just south of Durban. And we had the undesirable pleasure of having to live mid-center of a valley that was surrounded by 2 oil refineries, a paper mill, and on the other side, an industrial estate. So it wasn't the most ideal living conditions. And so coming through the 50s and 60s, you can imagine these people who were just brought out of their homes and families divided as such, being forced to live in these new housing estates and flats almost on top of each other. It was always going to end up creating chaos. And so I grew up in the 70s and 80s in and amongst this maelstrom of drug-related and alcohol-driven violence within our community. And unfortunately, that's something that has been established over the last few decades and continues to be the case in South Africa, which was a primary reason behind us relocating to the UK, was to, one, give our kids the opportunity to be able to travel and experience the world, and two, to give them the security that a first world education ensures they will have, and then also for safety and security. So moving over here, and we've been here for just a few years now. I'm proud to say we've established ourselves, we've established our roots, and this is home. And we got in just before COVID hit, December 2019, and so we were really privileged to get in ahead of that, because visas were cancelled and travel was cancelled as well. And, so we're really blessed to get here in time, and the kids have taken to it, starting to note a change in accent amongst a few of them, and we thrive.
Well, Chloe, first and foremost, thank you so much for sharing. And I can feel the emotional turmoil, actually, as you speak about the background. And may I say, the journey that you and your family have undertaken, and the work that you're doing, the positive impact that you are having, not only in what you do personally, but what you do professionally, I think is amazingly profound. And I really appreciate you sharing some of the difficulties.
Thanks, Leila. Thanks for acknowledging that. I think oftentimes people feel almost as though these issues, even though they're global ones, don't have direct impact on the nature of their own lives, and particularly in the Western world, in first world countries, where you can observe things from a distance, but not fully appreciate, I suppose, the fact that these issues that we've had to go through, when I say we, I mean people within minority groups over the last few hundred years, have deep-seated legacy issues. You know, you could argue even in the States that, Black culture hasn't fully gotten over the trauma associated with slavery. And the same, I suppose, to an extent is true in other parts of the world. I know the same is true for me. And my lived experience is such that I've been indoctrinated over time into perceiving the work that I bring as being subpar or substandard because of my appearance and because of where it is I come from and where I sat during apartheid within the pecking order, I suppose. So much so that I do things now and I can observe them. So, for example, growing up in South Africa, we knew that if you saw a white person walking on the pavement towards you, that you had to move out of the way. We knew that white police were figures of authority and that you weren't to muck about. We also knew that there was this perception of people of color coming into a store, perhaps for the wrong reasons. And so what's happened over time, I feel now, my experience here is that if I'm walking on a path up in the hills, and I live in a beautiful part of the country, incidentally, and I see somebody walking towards me, the first thing I need to do in my mind subconsciously is to remove my hands from my pocket, make sure that I've got my hands out so people can see that I'm not carrying anything and I'm not presenting, I'm not presenting with this imposing figure, or the threatening figure, I should say. Make sure that if I've got a beanie on or if I've got a hoodie on, I put that down and make sure that I greet with a smile on my face, just so that they don't feel uncomfortable. Now, you could argue, and rightfully so, that this is all within my mind, but all I'm trying to do here is just to explain how these issues become legacy issues within our lives. Another thing that I've experienced while being here is that if I'm walking into a store and I have a bag from another store, I have to make sure that I've, one, got the receipt, and two, that I know where it is, because if somebody says to me, did you put something in your bag, or did you buy all of that stuff from me? I've got proof to say that I have. And again, this is just the ramifications or the after effects, you could say, of that lived experience, which is very interesting, because you could ask modern education, how are they addressing these issues? One, and what is government really doing to ensure that these issues are dealt with? And we had a very hush-hush experience when it came to how we dealt with the transition between apartheid and our modern government in South Africa, in the sense that many issues went unresolved. And we had this Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came in to ensure that those who were key stakeholders in deploying apartheid were held to task. But we didn't really go through the process of healing. And so you've still got this very real, this very tangible angst in South Africa, where people are very much wound up to the extent where they are prepared to get violent and have these preconceived notions that haven't been addressed about other people from other ethnicities within the country.
Indeed. And it will take many years for these wounds to heal. Speaking about it is only one of many, many steps to take in order to educate and eradicate this kind of behavior. But as you say, this, this may be in your head, but it is from learnt experience. You watch and feel something happen time and time again. Naturally, you start to behave a certain way. And I'm curious, if you don't mind me asking, Clay, how you feel now that you are in the UK, and how your lived experience has shaped some of the things that you're now doing to put positive impact through education and into society and your children's futures ultimately, because you've almost utilized this, turned it around, pushed it in to the work that you do through higher education and learning ultimately. So talk to us a little bit about the transition from South Africa to the UK and the work that you do now.
Wasn't too much of a culture shock for my wife and I. Lived here between 2000 and 2002. While I was in the fire department in South Africa, I also played rugby, and I got the opportunity to play in Europe and ultimately in Wales. And my wife, who's a radiographer, got a position here in the NHS. And so she lived in Poole while I played rugby in North Wales. And we saw each other as often as we could. And so we experienced the culture as a couple for a couple of years. And interestingly enough, while we were here, there was a campaign in 2002 for teachers. There was a huge demand for teachers in the UK, and actually there still is. But the campaign very simply said, those who can, teach. And that resonated with me, because I remember key teachers within my life, and these characters, incidentally, who I have over time mimicked in certain ways because of the impact that they had had in my life growing up, particularly within high school. And because I'd gone through so many professions, the logic behind that was that I hadn't completely settled on what it was that I was meant to do within my life. And this campaign just brought me back to that. And so the idea of me joining education was born. So for us, it's almost a case of coming back to the UK to close a circle that we started all those years ago. And incidentally, the only reason we moved back to South Africa in 2002 was because We got pregnant with our firstborn, and we were just a little antsy, I suppose, about the idea of raising a kid on our own, so far away from friends and family. So coming back in 2019 was, I suppose, a homecoming in a sense. For the kids, it's been challenging, rightfully so. They're aged 13, 16 next month and 19. And the idea is, how do we make sure that we fill that space that is now missing between the relationships they had with so many of their friends in South Africa and the ones that they're looking to try and establish here? So that's been our challenging bit. The other part that's been challenging is the fact that we've moved to a part of the country that isn't entirely as diverse as where we've come from. And so the kids, when they joined the schools that they did, were more of a spectacle than I think they would have enjoyed being. So that's been a little bit of a challenge. But slowly and surely we assimilating. One of the things I think I must mention when it comes to settling in is this experience that we had during the Black Lives Matter movement in Bristol, where there was a march that we joined, and literally I stood there for the first 20 minutes as the crowd was listening to one of the speakers on the college green, and I couldn't quite process what I was seeing, because this was literally the first time in my life that I had seen white people en masse protesting for something that directly impacted my lived experience. And it was amazing for me to be able to see that, but it was just quite a seminal moment for me to appreciate that, and even more so the fact that it had come so late in my life resonated with me as well. So it's been a journey over the last couple of years. It's been one that's been filled with challenges, but one that we are absolutely relishing being able to take.
Wow, there's so many rich experiences there, and many that I can relate to myself. Your wife being a radiographer, going to work for the NHS, the same for my mum, and with your children, I have such a huge amount of empathy, because I remember my brother and I, when we came to the UK, whilst it wasn't different for us because we'd come from a very kind of diverse international school, suddenly being plunged into an environment where the children are, that they're all white, and looks do mean a certain thing when you are younger and you desperately want to fit in. And so, reflecting on your experiences, and now having the 3 children who are in the UK, must have been challenging, albeit full of, I'm sure, some very momentous kind of times in life for you. And one thing that I find is fascinating now that you found your way into the world of education, that this has become, in your own words, so close to your heart. And you'd mentioned previously in a conversation that education is such a primary facet in every society, and how do we hold people, hold government to task when it comes to issues regarding education? How do you feel about the system as it stands? And of course, I'm sure there's major differentials from this v South Africa. But what are your thoughts around this within the context of diversity and inclusion, especially given that you have 3 children going through education in schools right now?
Look, I think it's important that we acknowledge the fact that education 110% is a primary tenet of every society, and for better or for worse. And if we look at education, or mass public education, if as it were, essentially there are 4 primary roles that it plays within society. Obviously, at the top of the list has to be this idea of the economic value that it brings towards a society. And so there's the sense of ensuring that there's growth and sustainability within society. there's also this issue of the societal value that it holds. And so you've got this idea that, you know, we use education to organize communities around whatever the governmental agenda is for that period of time. And you've got this issue when it comes to the cultural value. And so even though you've got education that's been deployed nowadays for ethical and strategic reasons, you know, we need forms of education that, you know, enable our children to understand how it is they come to think the way they do. You know, we need a form of education when it comes to cultural value that explains to children why their values are so different from other values. And, you know, we need a form of education that's going to ensure that our kids understand why other people's values are not the same as our own. And so I feel that there's an issue, particularly when it comes to diversity and education, that we're not fully addressing. So there's this important element, and I suppose this is the fourth value when it comes to mass public education. This idea of developing education that speaks to the personal value within an individual's life. And I suppose this is where modern education fails and falls down a bit, because we need a system that is built for individuals rather than the collective. And when we consider that diversity is a fundamental part of what it is to be human, and then we consider that education is obsessed with this idea of conforming to societal norms and standards. And so we've got an issue with education, and this is purely just within my view. You know, we've got the system that's obsessed with grouping individuals according to their age, their ability, their ethnicity, their social, economic status. And this creates a bit of friction within society, which we clearly see locally and abroad. You know, because we're saying to our kids that it doesn't really matter that you aren't tall, that you aren't short, that you aren't fast, that you aren't slow, that you aren't black, that you aren't white, that you're not poor, that you aren't rich. We're saying all of these things to our own kids, all the while acknowledging that it actually does when it comes to education and within society. And so you have this issue of a lack of parity. And so you can have kids celebrated because they've got an A star in visual arts, as an example. But in the grand scheme of things, does that really matter when it comes to my A star in science? And so I think we're missing an opportunity here, because we celebrate children's ability to rote learn and to remember more than we celebrate anything else, more than we celebrate any other opportunities that education can present. And I think that we really need to move away from strategy and focus more on the impact that education has at the grassroots.
I'm nodding ferociously here as you're speaking, because there's so much in this that I agree with, and the way you describe it makes complete sense. Essentially, you know, modern education and historic education has failed. I mean, it's systemic ultimately, isn't it? And so this system that you're describing, it's very much kind of, you know, it's cookie cutter, as I like to call it. Cookie cutter models of success. Success looks like this thing, it's perfectly round. Yeah. Unfortunately, the same historically has existed within the workplace. And so how that translates through the various different life phases is something that needs to be broken but rebuilt in many different ways. And so how can we look at, to your point, personalization of the individual and celebration of the individual for those individual traits, those individual cultural experiences, and many other diversities of their background, personality, etc. But
it's not that difficult, though, Leila. It genuinely isn't. You know, policy, strategy, and legislation are fantastic tools. that government deploy to ensure that, societal norms and standards speak to the status quo. But the issue that I have, and many share, is that policy at the highest level is created by politicians, by people who aren't themselves teachers. And when it comes to our healthcare system, who aren't themselves nurses, who don't have that lived experience. So obviously there's going to be a disconnect between what happens at the top and what's actually happening at the bottom. And I think this is the biggest issue that we have, particularly within education, is that the wrong people are making the decisions, if that makes any sense.
So you're saying the differential between policy making and decision making at senior level is far beyond the realms of reality at grassroots level and reality that people are experiencing when it comes to education?
110%.
Where do you feel that governmental policy and decision making could aid some of the issues that we're seeing and that exist within early education?
Well, I think we need an overhaul. I think we need to change our educational framework. We're talking about a system that was created in the industrial age. What's changed over time? And in the industrial age, the focus from an economic perspective is to ensure that we have groups of people coming through processes to meet economic need. And so modern education needs to address modern societal need. And I think that process is happening within schools at the grassroots. I think that process is happening organically because teachers fundamentally want to establish positive relationships with the people that they teach. At the heart of teaching, people want to positively impact on those they engage and interact with. And so what our educational frameworks have to ensure they do more meaningfully is to better connect the people that are driving policy and strategic change with those who are working at the grassroots. And the reality of the situation is that people are working their backsides off to ensure that the students that they teach manage to complete curricula on time, manage to get through a day's worth of stress that's related to home, societal changes, body hormone changes, all of these things that are happening, teachers have to deal with. And essentially, if you look at it over time, teachers end up spending more time with your children than you do because of the time that they have them.
What you're saying essentially is that the role of a teacher is, it's critical. It is critical. The role of a teacher can shape the lives positively or negatively of young people. And I'm sure that we can all remember times in our youth where we were praised by a teacher and felt fantastic. We were told off by a teacher and felt terrible. And these teachers, we often remember them into our, into our professional careers. And it's those early experiences, those early interventions that really do shape the future. And so by positively impacting the minds of those in education, in early education, higher education, we really can shape the leaders of the future. And I think the work that you and UWE, Clay, have done is just absolutely, it's absolutely phenomenal. And I know you've modestly not mentioned that you've won a number of awards at the university and nominated for various things, but EDI, diversity and inclusion, whichever kind of analogy we're using, is something that ought to be taught in the curriculum. This is culture. It's something that is absolutely woven throughout the fabric of our society. And so ensuring that we are educated and we're bringing up well-rounded individuals is key.
I couldn't agree with you more, Leila. And I wouldn't be here as an educator if it wasn't for the four male figures, positive male figures in my life that I mentioned earlier. My father was murdered when I was just 3 years old, and it was quite a traumatic event in our lives, myself and my siblings. And my first stepfather was very abusive, physically abusive. I remember coming home from school as a young kid, maybe 8 years old, and seeing him on top of my mother with his knees holding her arms down and literally bashing her face in. And us trying to jump on top of him and pull him off of her, and just being flung into a wardrobe and flung into a wall. And that left an indelible mark on my psyche, as I'm sure it would anybody else in that situation. And so I grew up being very angry, and I was fighting with the world, and I fought with whoever it was who came into my path. And I had a troubled youth, you could say. And I suppose that's probably why I got so involved in rugby, because it was a physical outlet, and it was an opportunity, I suppose, for me to fight back and to physically abuse the white people who we invariably ended up playing against. Because I always felt that it wasn't fair that my father, and incidentally, I now know that he was murdered as a result of apartheid, within the context of apartheid, because of group areas and because of a whole host of other reasons. But the semantics don't matter in a sense, because that happened and my trajectory was mapped out. And you could almost say that my trajectory was planned for me to either end up dead, alcoholic, or a combination of things. But it didn't, because of the positive reinforcement that came from me engaging with these teachers that I had. They saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. They believed that I could be more than my circumstance. And that resonated with me. That never left me and is still with me. And this is why I feel it's so important that, we celebrate the nature of educators. One, that we empower them to, and three, that we ensure that the changes we want to see in society are made manifest through the frameworks that we're looking to deploy through education.
Hey, I am so grateful of you sharing with me and with our listeners your story. I know it's going to have had such a positive impact on many people, and I'm going to do my very best to summarize some of the learnings, which I'm already worried about because there's been so many learnings throughout everything that you have said. But some of the pieces that really stuck with me are that you truly aren't a product of your background. You can be more than your circumstance. Just because early life may have been traumatic, actually, it doesn't mean that you can't end up becoming an incredibly positive and successful individual like you have been. Some of the stories and the learnings that you've imparted on your students clearly show that early intervention when it comes to education, positive influences and role models are key and critical and do shape our future, because this is the beginning of many people's lives, the beginning of their professional lives. And you proved that real models, quote unquote, or I know we often talk about role models, but we love talking about real models in DAL, because actually it's those people that are, nose to the grindstone, working really hard every day to make a difference in the community that really matter. And so positive role models, positive real models, reinforcement for our future generations is really something that we ought to be striving for. And then finally, you mentioned the importance of storytelling. We simply cannot ignore the ills of the past, and it's really important that we talk about these horrible things that have happened in history. it might be something that we expect to see in history books, but when you talk about the 70s and 80s, this was not a long time away. And so this is a systemic issue that needs to be healed every single year, and it'll be many, many more years to come, but we can keep shaping the future to be positive if we keep re-educating and keep explaining and being as patient as we can, because actually, you know, it's patience, it's storytelling, it is you know, holding the hands of others as we take them through what have been, you know, difficult times, that we can become better people, not only ourselves, but also, you know, have those positive impacts on future generations of leaders. And you know, really, that's what it's all about, Clay.
Yeah. And we don't need to do it in a negative way. We don't need to indoctrinate people. We don't need to hold people to ransom. What we do need to do is to encourage dialogue, and we do need to allow for people to change on their own terms, yes, but we need to ensure that we're empathetic to their own experience. I was on a panel a couple of years back that was addressing the idea behind decolonizing the curriculum. And one of the things we spoke about was the issue of Black Lives Matters within the context of decolonizing. And at the end of the talk, we invited people to stay and to have a chat with the panelists. And so somebody came over quite delicately to ask. It was a white woman, and she asked, you know, she understands the idea behind why Black Lives Matter, but she doesn't understand why all lives don't. And so I was chomping at the bit to be able to answer the question. So I disregarded everybody else and put my hand up to answer the question. And I said, look, you're absolutely right. And number one, it's fantastic that you feel comfortable enough to come over and have this chat and ask the question, because that's genuinely what I want always, for people to feel that way. And yes, you're absolutely right. All lives do matter. They 110% do. The issue, though, is that they haven't always mattered. And that's what this movement is about. It's about trying to restore a level of parity. It's trying to address the wrongs of the past. And when we do that, though, we must make sure that we don't do it at the expense of everyone else's experiences.
Clay, you answered that perfectly, as expected. And I love that you welcomed the question with open arms as well. I really do, because well, we've seen it scattered across the press, haven't we? These kinds of questions, and many people have become angry about those kind of questions. But is anger the answer? You know, is what you're asking, the way that you addressed the woman who asked the question, actually in a very calm manner. You know, it was a well-meaning question ultimately, and that's what it requires. You know, it's the patience, it is the explanation, it is the storytelling, and it isn't a case of making equal the past. It's restoring parity, as you've rightly said. Clay, it's been a true pleasure having you on the podcast today. You have been wonderful. I could talk to you forever and a day. I learn something new every time I speak with you. I know that we're going to be speaking again very soon, but I really appreciate you sharing your personal experiences, and I'm very pleased that UWE has such a wonderful teacher and educator. Now, if anyone listening to today's podcast has been affected by any of the subjects, please make sure that you reach out and get in touch with us. Do make sure that you're not alone, and you know, if you do want to speak to someone about issues of race or any others, please don't be a stranger. Feel free to connect with Clay, feel free to connect with myself, or the DAL Global team. You can hit subscribe and subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, your favorite podcast app. Or if you'd like to see the annotated version, you can do in the show notes. Visit us at www.dalglobal.com/podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.